Okay, welcome back, you filthy exiles. So, it's been a while since I put a video out. I've been away for a little while, so I have been working on this build for some time, and I have like another 2 or 3 builds lined up that I want to work on too, so I'm by no means done for the league. Anyway, what are we talking about today? Well, this is my Black Zenith Juggernaut. Now, the conventional way to play this is on the Chieftain. The reason why I went the Juggernaut route was, number one, significantly cheaper to get, and number two, it's pretty damn tanky. Now the Chieftain would be equally tanky, if not tankier, in certain elements, but as far as a consistency sort of basis goes, we get to like max cap once we've got all of our endurance charges up. I think we get to like 85 or max capped 82% cold res and lightning res, so we're only like 8% res short of the full sort of kit. And so that's where the Chieftain sort of makes up. It is much harder to balance this build with resistances versus the Chieftain. And the thing that you lose on the Chieftain is pretty much just the free explode that you get off of Hinakora's Death Fury. But we compensate that differently with this build versus how you would play the Chieftain, because on the Juggernaut we get access to unflinching, which gives us endurance charges and another +1 endurance charge. So the mechanics are slightly different, but the same intended effect. That also allows us to play things like Infernal Cry, which compensates for Hinakora's Death Fury on the Chieftain Ascendancy versus the Jug Ascendancy. Is there any damage drop-off between the two Ascendancies? No, there isn't, not as far as I've seen. Anyway, let's talk about the build. So, the idea behind this build is stacking as much totem life as you possibly can on, in this case, Rejuvenation Totem, because it's got the highest base life of any totem. Now, some people may be like, oh, you should run Decoy Totem. Don't run Decoy Totem. The reason being is you don't need to run Decoy Totem because, number one, there's a cooldown on Decoy Totem, which makes it bad for this build. And on top of that, the other thing is we run Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame with Moon's Presence, which basically gives us the Chieftain Ascendancy that gives us Totem's Taunt, right? So, Totems taunt enemies for 4 seconds when they've been summoned. Now, alternatively, the builds that are running this setup on the Chieftain setup are running Unbreakable Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame. And the price difference between the two is somewhere around, it's like 140 to 200 chaos for both the Forbidden Flesh and Flame Jewels to run Moon's Presence on the Jug versus trying to get Unbreakable on Chieftain, which will set you back about 140 div. So this is much more budget friendly and gets the exact same intended output at the end of the day without breaking your bank, and means you can get on and put your currency into other gear and whatnot. So this is more achievable for the average everyday casual player like me versus extreme levels of the builds, which the Chieftain is excellent, but it's severely expensive. So if you want to spend the currency, you can go the Chieftain route. If you don't want to spend as much currency and you just want a fun build that will do pretty much everything, then the Juggernaut is perfectly acceptable. Now, where have I taken this build in Delve? I'm down around about 648 and pretty comfortably pushing down. A few of the limitations of this build too. So enemies that do not or cannot be taunted are a huge problem for this build, i.e. the base Elder fight. Horrible. There's no way that you can kill Elder with this build. Like standard Elder, it's laughable. Unless you run like a 4-link RF setup, and then it's going to be painful to do that. Maps like Siege, where the enemy drops totems, big problem. There's probably a few other bosses that I haven't really worried about too much that are an issue. The other big thing is this build pretty much banks on being tanky, because when you fight certain bosses, you basically have to cast the totems on top of yourself and then hope the enemy drags that attention towards to hit you. Some bosses don't get taunted by totems, so the easiest way is you become the taunt that triggers your totems to shoot off Flamewood. So yeah, now as far as damage scaling on the build, just to explain a little bit about how Flamewood works, basically Flamewood is linked to the life of your totems. So Flamewood support, basically support skills have 10% increased totems. Avenging Flame is then basically applied, and then Avenging Flame has a secondary stat which deals base fire damage equal to 140% of your totem's maximum life. So the more totem life that you stack, the more damage you're going to do. In this case, that's why we use rejuvenation totems, and the way that we get even more out of our rejuve totems is we run an ashes setup, and then the quality off of that amps up our rejuvenation totem's totem life, and then that gives us more damage. Now beyond that, we also use, wherever it's sitting, I think it's down here, not the Watcher's Eye. We use Rain of Splinters, which actually means my calc is slightly off by, I think, 4 projectiles on that basis. Actually, no, it's off by 8 projectiles, and we get a ton of projectile damage as well, so I'll do a quick recalc of that. So I think we do anywhere up to, we have 1 base projectile plus 2 plus 4. So we do, what's that, 7 projectiles per totem at 255,000 DPS per projectile per totem. So this build does slog a fair bit of damage, which is why it's quite good. And the other big advantage of the build is, when I say Black Zenith, you might be thinking, what does that mean? Black Zenith is a glove that, number one, it's a dirt cheap glove, right? 15C glove, set of gloves, which surprisingly is 15C, it's usually cheaper than that. That drops off of the not the Pinnacle boss, but the Pinnacle boss before you do Searing Exarch, which is the guy in like the oil slick or whatever. This set of gloves drops off that boss, and this gives you all the stats you need to be able to trigger your Flamewood totems effectively and do massive amounts of projectile damage. And basically, when you're on enemies, you just keep casting totems and keep taunting on enemies until they just obliterate your enemies. So it gives you 150% more damage. It does increase cooldown, but that's irrelevant because you're running totems. Just keep recasting totems. You get 4 additional projectiles, and projectile spells shoot in a circle as well. And projectiles have 80% less skill effect duration, which means nothing because it doesn't affect our totems in any way, shape, or form. So basically, you get all the upsides, none of the downsides when you run it with Flamewood on totems, which is why this is quite a good build. Now, defensively, my build sort of diverges off other builds. I went the Brass Dome route, and it's working fantastically. Easy way to get plus 5% maximum elemental resistances on the Juggernaut. And then the other big thing here is you will need a Shaped Shield, and the Shaped Shield must have +1 maximum number of summoned totems. Now, the other thing I do in my build is I also am running Ancestral Bond. It gives me another totem. I don't need to do damage myself. I'm not running IRF in my setup, and it works perfectly in Delve. And the other thing to keep in mind is I run a Dark Seer, which I think this is pretty cheap. Yeah, 40 Chaos. And this gives us +2 to spell skill gems. It also gives us a stack of life. And enemies blinded are afflicted with malediction, which isn't a huge thing. But we synergize a lot of blind on this build too, because this build also stacks a ton of armor. So we run around with idly 94,000 armor, and then once we start using it, we get anywhere up to 160, 170,000 armor. And we run Unbreakable, so the armor is mitigating elemental damage as well. And we also run the node in here, which converts, sorry, not there, here, which converts armor to also absorb some of our chaos damage. And beyond that point, I'm also running Soul of Arakali, which means I can basically face tank Shapers stuff and all sorts of things like that. Dot does not affect this build. So yeah, it's really strong against a lot of things. Now, as far as T17s, I did almost complete a T17 map with this. It was pretty easy. The only problem is I had my stupid Maven ticked on, and I also am running a boss rush strategy on this too. So it tripled the T17 bosses and wiped the floor with me. But had I not have done that, this can pretty consistently do moderate levels of T17 maps too without any major issues. Pretty much does all content in the game comfortably, pushes down and Delve comfortably at a really moderate price. Things like a 5-link Brass Dome is dirt cheap, like, well, 2 div. Like, it's not a huge thing. The only thing is you just have to off-color your gloves, and realistically, like, you only really need a 5 to a 4-link setup in this whole build, so it's really good. The other thing I'm using in this build too, you'll notice, is Tides of Time, and we'll talk about it, basically gives me a ton of flask uptime, and my flasks aren't optimized by any means, but it means I can keep phasing up constantly in combination with phase run with automation. So you'll notice that I move very quickly because I also have a 13% buff from my Watcher's Eye because I'm running Grace. And then on top of that, I'm also running a Iron Reflexes setup. So we'll talk about that later. So I'm just stacking all the armors at this stage. Now, as far as ailment immunities, I'm also running Purity of Elements in this build, as we can see here. So, yeah, nice and easy. And the way that I get around doing a lot more AoE damage and map clear is I'm running a combination of Legacy of Fury as well as Infernal Cry. And I've got Infernal Cry set up on Call to Arms. Now, you'll also notice all my setups are set up on Life Tap because this build gets anywhere up to like 2,000 life regeneration per second. So it's got a lot of regeneration built into it as well. Super tanky, super easy. The other big advantage is you're literally just hitting like one button. Everything else is automated. Sorry, two buttons. Sometimes you have to drop your brands to be able to apply flammability. I'm sorry, two buttons. I know is a lot of buttons, but you know, unfortunately, I just could not get it down to one button efficiently enough. Anyway, let's get into the PoB check and we'll talk about the DPS numbers. Then we'll go through gearing, skill gem setup, PoE tree, and yeah, we'll call it there after that. Okay, before we get into it, I'll just explain how the damage works, right? So with everything up, we have 255,000 DPS per projectile, right? This is per Avenging Flame trigger, right? And so what that means is we have a few areas where we're getting additional projectiles. Now, Black Zenith gives us a +4 number of projectiles, right? Our actual gem gives us 1. So we have 5 in the combination of those two. Now, the other thing that we're running is obviously our Rain of Splinters gem as well. That gives us another +2 additional projectiles on top of it all. So when we calculate all that out, 7 projectiles per totem at 255 DPS per projectile gets us to 1.785 million DPS per totem. If all projectiles hit, that is, best case scenario, times by 4 totems equals 7.14 million DPS is the max peak point of DPS on this build. Is that bad? No, that's pretty okay. Like, that can do most things. The build's not designed to be a zoom blast character. Like, you're not going to crank a boss in 2 seconds. But it is still pretty fast. It's good for delve like that as well. And the build is super tanky, so I can sustain a fight if it does drag out a bit longer. And so I'll just preface that with this build. This build is not made for everybody. This build is made for tank enthusiasts that just want to be really lazy. I'm just really enjoying running delve with this build because it's just easy mode, basically. Anyway, configurations. Let's talk about it. So, Soul of Arakali, Soul of Gruth, cool. I do have time spent stationary at 5, but it really doesn't affect the build. The reason why we have that is because we're running Rational Doctrine. And so we have that set up in... where have we got that? Here. Basically, what this gives us is Consecrated Ground lingers for 4 seconds, and we generate Consecrated Ground because our strength is our highest attribute in the setups, 200 versus 158 and 150, so we got more strength than anything else. So we get Consecrated Ground, so easy way to get Consecrated Ground. That's probably the most expensive item in this build, by the way. Endurance charges, yes, we have endurance charges because we're a jug and we run unflinching. Life taps on everything in the build, so there's no mana cost in the entire build. Flask active, do you have a totem summon? Duh, it's a totem build. Have you summoned a totem recently? That's all we're doing. Number of totems is 4, so it drops it by 2,000 DPS. Sorry, I'm off by a few thousand DPS. Number of times you've been hit recently, I'm going to say 5, but basically you're just always taking hits. Now, brands are up, no other changes here, no other changes in here. Is the enemy blinded? Yes, because we get that from both our Scepter, but we also get that from our Watcher's Eye as well, because we run Grace. So we've got 40% chance to blind enemies on hit, in which hit you while affected by Grace. So because I'm an armor character, I'm using Grace to proc armor. When enemies hit me, they have a 40% chance to get blinded before it combines with my Scepter as well. So it's like 50% chance for enemies to get blinded at any point in time. And this is only like a 3 div Watcher's Eye, by the way. It wasn't very expensive. Enemies are burning and ignited, yes. And then we have Herald of Ash in the build as well, which procs up my DPS a little more. I'm pretty sure I have Herald of Ash in this setup. Yep, we got Herald of Ash in here too. All right, that's basically it for the configuration. Guardian Pinnacle damage, really simple stuff, nothing crazy. Haven't really tweaked too much in here. It's really boilerplate. So let's talk about the gearing. All right, ignore my stash of hell. I did some runs and I hadn't actually done anything, and then I got home from work and I was like, oh, I should do my video tonight on this. So, helm. All right, implicits on the helm. I don't have the right XR I don't have the right Eater of Worlds implicit. You want to convert it to fire damage because we're at 90% fire, essentially fire maximum resist. But I do have then 8% physical damage taken is recouped as life. Then beyond that, I've got the Darkseer Scepter. This gives us +2 to all spell skill gems, which gives us +2 to our rejuvenation totems. Pardon me. It gives us a ton of life and a ton of mana as well. And it gives us global blind for enemies on hit. Now, whether or not that has an effect with totems, I have no idea. But it also means that we're unaffected by blind too. And this got changed this league, so it's actually pretty powerful now with the +2 to skill to spell skill gems. Now, I also run a Brass Dome on this setup. This is uncorrupted, and it's just a 5-link, as you can see here. And then beyond this, I have an Ashes with Charisma Anoint on it. My Ashes isn't perfectly rolled, so if I roll this perfectly, I get more damage out of this build. And my shield, pardon me, has +3% maximum fire resistance and +1 to maximum number of summoned totems. So it's a bit of a unique shield. You can only get those rolls on a Shaper base, unfortunately, but it's not an expensive roll, and you can get a dime a dozen. And if you've got enough dexterity, you could run a dex shield instead of running a strength shield if you wanted to. Because we're running iron reflexes, we're going to convert the dex. We're going to convert any evasion into armor anyway, so we're going to reap the benefits either way. Then in the ring setup, so basically I got amethyst rings, and I have these rings did cost a little bit more. Basically, damage recouped as life, any resistances, and flat life built into these as well. And where I could, non-channeling skills have -7 total mana cost, but it's irrelevant to have that stat now looking at it. So you could change that to anything you wanted to. Then my gloves, obviously, it's a Black Zenith build, so we have Black Zenith gloves. To off-color these, basically, you just want to use the crafting bench and then just change the sockets until you get the right colors. Maybe I'll do another video if people want to see how to do that simplistically. It's super easy. And then I'm running the Tides of Time belt. This belt's actually really cheap. Oh, doesn't have a price. Anyway, it's really cheap. It's not even a div. It's easy, yeah. But, well, it depends on the role. Basically, you just want to make sure that utility flasks have as high roll as possible. In this case, 3 charges every 3 seconds. We don't care about mana flasks, and we don't care about life flasks. So do with that what you will. And you also get 25% increased flask effect. Super useful belt. Makes this build a lot easier because you have constant flask uptime, which means you're phasing and armor and things like that stay up for longer. And then finally, we're running Legacy of Fury, which is corrupted with a +2 implicit of +2 to socketed AoE gems, and that's buffing up our Purity of Elements, Determination, and Grace to around level 25 once they're maxed out. And I've got a level 3 Enlighten set up in that too. Beyond that, my flask, I'm running a Jade Flask, Ruby Flask, so I can cap my fire res out. I'm running a Granite Flask, Quicksilver Flask, and Quartz Flask. And now and again, I might change the Quartz Flask out for a Basalt if I'm fighting a particularly crappy boss. And my Basalt is a trash Basalt, so I need to improve that too. So yeah, that's basically it for gearing. Super simple gearing, not very expensive to gear at all. You could min and max this to the 9s if you wanted to make it much better than my build. This will get you going though. Ashes aren't expensive. All this gear is relatively cheap. Probably, what's that? Less than like 6 to 8 div in gear tops. Worst case scenario with this setup currently as it is. Okay, gem setups. In the helm I'm running Void Sphere, Arcanus Brand, Flammability, and Life Tap. Reason why I'm running Void Sphere is it pulls enemies into one zone when you hit an enemy, so it pulls packs together, and then you cast the totems on the pack, and then that does a lot more damage because you're going to do splash damage and everything in that one zone. Just makes it more efficient to kill stuff with. Then in the Scepter, Leap Slam, Life Tap, Attack Speed, because, you know, Leap Slam is better than Shield Charge, arguably, in my opinion, though that feels really slow for some reason. I don't know. Okay, and then in our shield we're running Call to Arms, Infernal Cry, and Life Tap. This is giving us our AoE where we're getting the booms. As you can see, that's the Life Tap. Sorry, the Infernal Cry going off. Now in, pardon me, in our chest we're running Molten Shell, Increased Duration, Automation, Phase Run, and Life Tap. And on our 6th socket that isn't linked, we're running Herald of Ash. Then in our gloves, we're running Rejuvenation Totem. This is a 2120 gem, and it's super cheap. We can actually price check it right now. It's like 15 chaos. This is a cheap build. And then Flamewood, which is 2120. This is a little more expensive. We can price check that. Yeah, 50 chaos. You know, might break the bank, not sure. And then multiple totems and life tap on that. And then in our boots, running Enlighten, Purity of Elements, Determination, and Grace as our aura setup. Pretty simple gem setup, not very expensive at all. And the benefit is there's no Awakened gems required in this build either. So, yeah, cheap. Okay, yeah, skill tree. All right. So we're going to come down in the Marauder Ascendancy here, or Marauder area here, pick up Heart of the Warrior, and then we're basically going to pick up these strength nodes. We want to get Prismatic Skin, Corrupted Blood Immunity, and then we come down, we rush down to our Totem Mastery, and we want to pick up these Totem Wheel nodes really early. I think I switched to Flamewood like by Act 4 as soon as I could, and I was running it in combination with RF. To level this build, you're going to want to run just a standard RF setup. Dirt cheap, super easy, just RF and totems, and then eventually you're going to turn the RF off when the totems become pliable, and once you're able to run Black Zenith, then basically you just get rid of RF. I just got rid of RF. You could keep it on, you get more spell damage, but it drops your life regeneration too low unless you got a Mageblood on your setup, which I don't have a Mageblood yet, because I keep investing into builds. Then yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about keeping RF on. And then you also want to grab Iron Reflexes, because dexterity stacking evasion isn't worth crap in this build. Then we come up, we grab Cloth and Chain, and then we want to get 8% increased armor and evasion from this mastery node here. And because we stack 5 endurance charges, that's what, 40% increased armor just there. Then we come up and I've got our first Forbidden Flesh jewel here, but you can put whatever jewel you've got at that point. And the other thing is you want to take 5% of damage from hits as taken from your nearest totem, because our totems are stacking nearly 15,000 life per totem. They can take some abuse. They're good for it. And so basically, we come up, I'll talk about the tattoos after. We come up, we go out, grab Constitution, Iron Will. I've also got Dynamo here, which means guard skills have an increased duration. This allows me to get 12% increased mana reservation efficiency as well. And it means Molten Shell's up a lot more, so we're a lot more defensive. Then I've got my Watcher's Iron here, which has Blind with Grace and movement speed when Grace is active. And I come across and grab my 30 Dex, which lets me run Grace as one of my defensive auras. Pardon me. And level it up to level 20. And then I come up and grab Light of Divinity into Holy Dominion. We come down and grab Devotion. And now this is something new in this league. I did grab the extra endurance charge here, but I am running the dirt cheap version of the Perendus Pact, which it's not in the thing. It's super cheap. Like, this is the one that drops commonly. And people are like, oh, that's garbage. Well, for this build, it's really good in this area, because for every one of these nodes, we get 7% increased evasion rating. And because we use evasion with Iron Reflexes to stack more armor, that means that for every single node that we select within this radius, we are getting 7% armor. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 nodes times 7% of additional armor, which is why I have so much idle armor. Super useful jewel. Only thing I'm going to miss when the league changes, because it's not a great league, this league. But this is a super useful jewel to use, and super affordable as well. And then we come up and we want to grab Ancestral Bond. After you've converted out of RF, if you take this before RF, you'll lose all your damage off RF, so I don't recommend until you get the build into the later levels, probably like level 80 to 90, take this node. Then we come down and grab Primal Manifestation. We want to stack more totem life where we can, and physical damage reduction. And then 60% increased global crit chance from totem summoned recently, which is then going to synergize with your elemental overload, but we'll talk about that after. Then we come down and we also grab Sovereignty. We want to grab 8% increased damage for each of your auras as well. And then we want to grab Purity of Flesh, come in and grab Explosive Impact, and Critical Strikes do not inherently ignite, 100% increased damage against ignited enemies, which is going to proc off Herald of Ash as well. Then we come up, we grab the Agility node up here, Elemental Overload, which is going to proc more elemental damage. We don't need to crit with this build, we just need to absolutely throttle our elemental damage, so you don't need to worry about crit multi. I did play with that, it could work, wouldn't recommend it. You need to then use mana, and it just becomes more complicated to balance. Then we come across and we'll grab the Cruel Preparations node. Now I do have a tattoo increasing my Chaos Resistance here, but yeah, that was just because I had it sitting around. And then we just grab this wheel up here. I do have Master of Fire, which does give fire exposure to all enemies in the vicinity, so I don't need to run that on gloves because I wouldn't be able to do that anyway. And then I've got a Rational Doctrine gem and my other Forbidden Flame gems set up in here. Now, as far as my main tattoos in this build that you want to start using the 5% increased totem life tattoos, which are surprisingly really cheap because nobody's really playing totem builds in this league. It's every other type of build, but not totems, which is great because it means that we can abuse this mechanic to the nines. Now, ascendancy-wise, first ascendancy I went with was Untiring because I was running RF to level this build up, and then basically you want to get Unflinching, Unstoppable, you want to get Unbreakable, then Unstoppable as your fourth ascendancy after that, and you are Rider's Reign, and then you put your Forbidden Flesh and your Forbidden Flame in, and you get Moon's Presence, and that gives you Totem's Taunt. Now, while you're leveling up too, it might be a good idea to run Decoy Totems as opposed to Rejuvenation Totems. This just means that your toon will be able to, taunt things without having Moon's Presence. The other alternative is level it up as RF, level it up as the Chieftain, so you get the Moon's Presence early, then switch the Ascendancy after you sort of get to the stage where you can run Flamewood Totems, or once you get the Moon's Presence, Forbidden Flesh, and Forbidden Flame Gems. This is not a League Starter variant. If you were going to play this on League Starter, you would probably you would have to run the Chieftain because you get the Native Ascendancy built in, and then you're just going to have to either move to Unbreakable or get Moon Presence Gems, which are pretty cheap, jewels, which are pretty cheap either way. Anyway, that's basically the tree setup. PoB will be in the description. Okay, so hopefully this build is helpful. This is obviously a very different build, and I didn't initially design this build. This build's been around for a number of leagues, but I did make it juggable, which was a lot more fun and made it a lot more affordable. Anyway, if you've got any questions, feel free to hit me up in the description below, or the comments below. Hopefully I've covered off on enough questions and or potential questions that might come up from this build. And yeah, like, it's not great at bosses, candidly. It's not the best bosser. It still does bosses pretty well. There are certain bosses it struggles with, but it is quite good at delving. As I said, 650 plus. I'm just pushing down at this stage to see how far it can go. And yeah, anyway, it's just a fun build. It's interesting. It's different. It's not the same old crap that every other content creator is putting out there. As will my next builds will be also very off-meta. I find I'm just playing more off-meta stuff now because I've played so many damn builds. I just want to play cool skills that are interesting. Not necessarily the most efficient builds out there, but things that are fun. Because the way that I see this game is it's about fun. Anyway, if you like this video, don't forget to like and sub to the channel. Don't forget to follow the Twitch. I stream on there most nights. I'll be on there tonight even. And also don't forget to follow the Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it these days. And until next time, I will see you guys later.